What would you do if the person you trusted most built your life on lies and the whole world found out? Tonight, we're diving into a story filled with betrayal, exposure, and a revenge that went far beyond anyone's expectations. This is not just about heartbreak. It's about justice, resilience, and the price of deception. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next twist. Now, let's step right into the drama of her lies were publicly exposed. But my revenge went even further. Kurt first noticed Evelyn on a bright spring afternoon at their small-town high school. Her auburn hair caught the sun at just the right angle, and for a suspended heartbeat, he forgot whatever assignment he was hurrying to finish. What held him wasn't only the flash of color. It was the unmistakable resolve in her green eyes, the way she walked like someone who already knew where she was going. Confidence like that didn't show up often in hallways full of teenagers. When it did, it changed the temperature of a room. In the days that followed, Kurt kept finding reasons to be near her. He offered to swap lab partners in biology so he could help her with a finicky dissection, joined an after-school club he'd never considered, and even picked up weekend shifts at the little bookstore off Main Street because she worked there on Fridays. None of it felt forced. Evelyn had a quick laugh that softened her sharp edges, and she noticed his kindness, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he turned awkward moments into jokes that landed. A quiet friendship formed and then, almost without announcement, started to deepen. One warm evening during junior year, they walked home from a community event where she'd been volunteering. The town's streetlights hummed softly. The air smelled like cut grass. Kurt's hand brushed hers once, then again, and he finally gathered the courage to hold it. Evelyn didn't pull away. She tilted her head, smiled a small, certain smile, and threaded her fingers through his. The moment was simple, but it felt like a hinge swinging their lives in a new direction. From there, everything moved with a natural rhythm. They studied in the library until closing, sharing whispers about teachers and futures. They lay on the football field at night, mapping constellations and making promises that felt safe under the stars. Evelyn's fire met Kurt's calm in a way that made both of them better, her boldness pulling him forward, his steadiness giving her a place to land. Friends said they were a perfect balance. Maybe they were. What most people couldn't see were the fault lines Evelyn carried from home, arguments behind closed doors, a love that changed shape too often to be trusted. With Kurt, she could set the weight down. He learned how to read the tension in her shoulders, how to offer a quiet room, a cup of tea, or a joke at the right time. In return, she believed in him out loud. "Don't shrink your dreams," she'd say, tapping his notebook where he kept sketches of engines and shop layouts. "Give them a real address." By senior year, they were planning the practical parts of forever. Colleges close enough to share Sundays, budgets that made sense, part-time jobs that wouldn't devour all their hours together. They fought sometimes. Evelyn's temper sparked fast. Kurt's patience stretched thin when he felt dismissed. But their apologies came quickly, and the repairs held. Each weekend they escaped to the countryside, hiking narrow trails, swimming in cold, hidden lakes, letting wind dry their hair as they leaned against the hood of his car. The world felt bigger with the two of them in it, and also somehow easier to carry. Prom gave shape to their hope. Kurt picked a corsage the exact shade of her favorite dress and saved for a dinner he couldn't really afford. Under a canopy of lights that made everyone look more cinematic than they were, they danced close, her head near his shoulder, his breath steadying at the base of her neck. Music blurred around them. "We'll make it," she whispered, and he believed her the way you believe the tide will come in. Graduation arrived like a sunrise, expected, still stunning. Caps flew, families cheered. On the edge of the parking lot, away from the noise, they promised each other the same thing in different words, that the distance between their futures would always be negotiable, that love would be the constant. Neither of them could imagine a crack wide enough to alter those vows. Neither of them could imagine how quickly life can test even the strongest designs. They walked home slowly that night, fingers intertwined, mapping out a summer of work shifts and late movies and one last camping trip before everything changed. The town felt small and generous, like it wanted them to win. For a while, they did. For a while, the story turned exactly the way they wrote it. Graduation did not mark an ending for Kurt and Evelyn. It opened the door to a new chapter they had long imagined together. With diplomas in hand and hope blazing bright, they rented a modest apartment just a few blocks from their community college. The space was small, with creaking pipes and second-hand furniture, yet to them it felt like the headquarters of their future. Their days soon filled with routine, early classes, long shifts at their part-time jobs, and late evenings bent over textbooks at the kitchen table. Kurt pursued automotive technology, grease staining his hands but pride shining in his eyes. Evelyn studied business administration, her sharp mind already sketching out strategies and plans for a life beyond ordinary. Despite exhaustion, they carved out time for each other. Quiet dinners of pasta and canned sauce, movie nights with blankets on the floor, Sunday mornings spent dreaming aloud. Kurt often spoke about opening his own automotive shop, his voice quickening with every detail of lifts, tools, and loyal customers. Evelyn listened carefully, filling notebook margins with budgets and business models, shaping his dream into something tangible. Together, they felt unstoppable, his technical passion fueled by her organizational discipline, their combined vision becoming the scaffolding of a shared destiny. Years of determination brought steady progress. Kurt earned an apprenticeship with a respected mechanic, learning not only how to repair cars, but also how to manage a shop with confidence. Evelyn's dedication at the insurance office earned her promotions and recognition, her reputation as a sharp, capable woman spreading quickly. Their finances stabilized, allowing them to upgrade their apartment and think bigger. Even as challenges arose, arguments sparked by Evelyn's fiery temperament or Kurt's quieter way of retreating, they always found a way back. Kurt's patience smoothed her sharp edges, and her energy kept him from becoming complacent. When a local businessman offered Kurt a management position at a franchise with the promise of eventual ownership, Evelyn hesitated, fearing the risk. Yet she trusted his judgment and stood firmly at his side. Together, they celebrated small victories, contracts signed, projects finished, late nights that ended with laughter instead of stress. Their community saw them as a young couple on the rise, admired for their drive and their affection. Their partnership became a story whispered with admiration, two people who seemed destined to conquer the future together. But beneath their triumphs, unseen fault lines were forming. Long hours kept them apart more often than they realized. Ambition, once a shared fire, began to cast uneven shadows. For now, though, their love still glowed brightly, disguising the cracks that would one day widen. Several years into adulthood, Kurt and Evelyn's life appeared polished from the outside. Their careers were advancing, their home was more comfortable, and the couple often drew admiration from neighbors who saw them as proof that young love could endure. Yet behind closed doors, subtle shifts began to whisper warnings. Kurt's growing responsibilities at the franchise demanded longer hours. He came home late, sometimes after midnight, his hands still smelling of oil, his shoulders weighed down by exhaustion. Evelyn, though initially supportive, began to feel the sting of neglect. The dinners she prepared often went cold before he arrived, and the quiet evenings they once treasured turned into long, lonely waits. Her fiery nature, once a charm that sparked energy in their relationship, now flared into irritability. Small inconveniences ignited arguments that lingered longer than before. Where Kurt once soothed her temper with patience and gentle words, he now felt worn thin, uncertain how much more he could smooth over. Their laughter, once effortless, grew rare, replaced by silence that pressed heavy on their walls. One evening, a disagreement over something trivial, household chores, spiraled into a storm. Evelyn's voice cracked with years of pent-up frustration. She accused Kurt of loving his career more than her, of choosing wrenches and contracts over the woman who had stood by him since high school. Kurt tried to reassure her, his tone calm, but his words fell flat against her rising anger. The rift from that night lingered like smoke, seeping into every interaction afterward. Weeks passed, and Kurt began to notice Evelyn slipping away, though she still sat beside him at the dinner table. Her eyes wandered, distracted, her phone lighting up more often. Conversations with him grew shallow, her responses curt or defensive. He would ask softly, "Is something wrong?" But each inquiry only seemed to irritate her further. At work, Evelyn found a new confidant, Marcus, a colleague with an easy smile and a patient ear. What began as harmless venting slowly evolved into late-night texts and quiet conversations in the break room. She told herself it was innocent, that she simply needed someone who understood the pressure she carried. But each word shared with Marcus widened the distance between her and Kurt. Kurt, meanwhile, tried desperately to repair what was breaking. He planned romantic dinners, bought small gifts, suggested weekend getaways, but Evelyn's warmth no longer matched his efforts. Her smiles were faint, her embraces brief. With every unanswered gesture, confusion gnawed at him, leaving him restless at night, staring at the ceiling as Evelyn scrolled on her phone beside him. The atmosphere at home thickened with tension. Simple interactions, passing each other in the hallway, sharing the same couch, felt strained, as though invisible walls were rising between them. Kurt's optimism, once his shield, began to erode under the weight of doubt. One evening, Evelyn came home later than usual. She explained vaguely that a meeting had run long, but her eyes avoided his. Kurt's stomach clenched with an instinct he could not ignore. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the girl he once held under starry skies was still the same woman before him. Yet unease coiled inside him like a warning he could not silence. As weeks turned into months, Kurt stopped asking and started observing. He noticed the way she guarded her phone, stepping into another room to answer calls. He saw the careful effort in her appearance each morning, the new perfume she claimed was a gift from a co-worker. Still, he clung to hope. Each night he whispered to himself that it was only a phase, that love this deep could not vanish so easily. But the silence between them told another story. And in the quiet of their once vibrant home, Kurt could not escape the gnawing question. Were these just passing storms, or the first cracks of something breaking beyond repair? The unease that had shadowed Kurt for months grew heavier with each passing day. Evelyn, once so open and spontaneous, now seemed shrouded in secrecy. She carried her phone like a lifeline, never leaving it unattended, even during meals. Calls were taken in hushed tones behind closed doors, and messages lit her screen late into the night. The woman who used to fall asleep mid-conversation now turned her back to him, scrolling in silence. Kurt tried to dismiss his doubts at first, telling himself exhaustion was twisting his perception. But his instincts whispered otherwise. Every new behavior, her sudden attention to her appearance, the unfamiliar perfume she wore, the careful way she avoided his gaze, felt like puzzle pieces sliding into place. One evening, Evelyn stepped into the shower after a long day. For the first time in weeks, she left her phone face down on the kitchen table. Kurt stood over it, heart pounding. His conscience screamed for restraint, but suspicion clawed at him until his hand moved on its own. He turned the screen over and saw a notification. The name was Marcus. The message was brief, casual on the surface, yet dripping with intimacy when read through the lens of doubt. The late hour alone was enough to send a sharp chill through his chest. He placed the phone back exactly as he found it, his hands trembling. That single glimpse confirmed the storm he had tried so hard to deny. From that night forward, he could no longer convince himself that Evelyn's distance was temporary. Kurt became quieter, more observant. He watched how she lingered in front of the mirror before work, applying makeup with a precision that hadn't been there before. He noticed her slipping on jewelry he hadn't seen in years, spraying perfume she insisted was a gift from a female colleague. Her explanations sounded rehearsed, her smiles too quick, too hollow. At work, Kurt's distraction became impossible to hide. He fumbled tools, missed details on contracts, and his coworkers noticed the change. Ryan, his closest friend in the shop, finally cornered him one afternoon. "What's going on with you?" Ryan asked, his tone both firm and concerned. After a pause heavy with shame, Kurt admitted his fears. Ryan urged caution. "Don't assume the worst without proof. Don't let suspicion poison everything." But Kurt could hear the thinness in his own voice when he tried to agree. At home, the facade grew harder to maintain. Evelyn smiled more around Marcus at company events, small looks that Kurt caught when she thought no one was watching. Their laughter carried a familiarity that cut him deeper than any argument ever had. Each exchange, no matter how brief, twisted like a knife, confirming what his gut had already told him. Sleep became elusive. Kurt lay awake replaying every detail, the late nights, the guarded phone, the message, the perfume. His love for Evelyn wrestled with a mounting certainty that she was slipping into another man's arms. He wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding, that their years together still meant something unshakable. But the weight in his chest told him the truth. Trust was no longer whole, and once cracked, it never returned the same. As days blurred into weeks, Kurt resolved that silence could no longer be his refuge. The tension had grown unbearable, and pretending ignorance only deepened his torment. A confrontation was inevitable. He began rehearsing the words in his mind, practicing calm even as his insides roiled with dread. He remembered the nights under the stars when Evelyn whispered promises of forever, and he wondered how promises could die so quietly. He feared the answer, feared that once spoken aloud, it would change everything. Yet he also knew the truth was no longer something he could postpone. The path forward had become clear. He had to face Evelyn no matter the cost. The evening Kurt had dreaded arrived like a storm that could no longer be delayed. He prepared dinner with careful precision, hoping the ritual of a shared meal might soften the confrontation he knew was inevitable. The table was set, candles flickering weakly, but the warmth they offered could not melt the frost that had settled between them. Evelyn came home later than usual, her face composed but distant, her words clipped and mechanical. She sat across from him, chewing slowly, her eyes fixed anywhere but his. For a while, silence ruled the room. Kurt's pulse thundered in his ears as he forced the words out. "Evelyn, what's happening to us? You're not here anymore. You're with me, but you're not with me." His voice trembled but carried a firmness he hadn't felt before. Evelyn's fork clattered softly against the plate. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, Kurt thought she might break down in honesty. Instead, her voice came sharp, defensive. "You're imagining things. You're insecure. Do you want to control every part of my life?" Her denial cut deeper than admission would have. The evasions, the sudden flashes of anger, only confirmed what Kurt already feared. Their conversation unraveled quickly, escalating into raised voices, accusations, and wounded silence. The years of devotion they had built seemed to dissolve in the span of minutes, leaving Kurt hollow. That night, lying awake beside her, Kurt knew words alone would never unearth the truth. If Evelyn could not admit it, then he would have to find proof himself. The decision hardened in his chest like stone. Over the following days, he became deliberate. He watched her routines more closely, marked the odd absences, the unexplained hours. And then, one afternoon, fate delivered what he had long suspected. Evelyn left her office earlier than usual, her movements hurried and uncharacteristic. Kurt followed at a cautious distance, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Her car led him to a part of town he barely recognized, a stretch of road lined with motels, their neon signs buzzing in the daylight. His stomach twisted violently as she pulled into a narrow parking lot. From the shadows of his car, he watched her step out, adjusting her blouse nervously, her eyes scanning the lot as if to make sure she wasn't followed. Then she walked toward one of the doors. The handle turned. The door opened, and there stood Marcus. Kurt's breath caught in his throat as Evelyn leaned into Marcus's arms. Their embrace was not casual, not professional, not anything a wife should ever share with another man. It was intimate, certain, and practiced, an unspoken declaration of betrayal made visible in the harsh afternoon sun. For a long moment, Kurt could not move. His heart pounded, his vision blurred, and the weight of betrayal pressed on him until he felt hollow. Every memory of Evelyn's promises, every moment they had built together, cracked under the image before him. With trembling hands, he lifted his phone and captured the scene in silence, evidence he neither wanted nor could ignore. Each click of the camera felt like a nail sealing the coffin of their marriage. He drove home slowly, his mind a storm of grief, anger, and reluctant relief. The gnawing uncertainty that had haunted him for months was gone, replaced by the cold certainty of betrayal. There was no room left for denial. That night when Evelyn returned, Kurt was waiting. His demeanor was calm, but his eyes held a new firmness. He placed his phone on the table between them, sliding it toward her. The images glowed under the dim light, impossible to dismiss. The color drained from Evelyn's face. For a moment she tried to speak, tried to deny, to fabricate, but the words faltered and died in her throat. Silence stretched, suffocating, until at last she whispered, "Yes, it's true." Her admission was a dagger, yet also a strange release. For Kurt, the world had shifted. Their life together, once defined by shared dreams and whispered promises, was now reduced to ash. But in that ash, he felt something unexpected, the first breath of clarity. Their marriage was broken beyond repair, and though pain seared through him, Kurt knew this moment marked not only the end of their life together, but also the beginning of his reckoning. The days after Evelyn's confession moved like shadows across Kurt's home. Silence filled every corner, a silence not of peace but of heaviness, where every breath seemed weighted with things unsaid. Their interactions became clipped and mechanical, passing comments about bills, groceries, schedules, spoken without warmth, without eye contact. The woman who once filled the apartment with laughter now moved quietly through the rooms like a ghost, and the man who once anchored her with patience felt himself adrift in bitterness. Kurt could not escape the image of her in Marcus's arms. It replayed behind his eyes when he closed them at night, invaded his thoughts during work, and gnawed at him in every quiet moment. The betrayal had split something deep inside him, love and rage colliding, grief and indignation warring for dominance. He had given Evelyn years of loyalty, and in return she had dismantled their marriage piece by piece in secrecy. Evelyn, though consumed by guilt, struggled to bridge the chasm. She offered small apologies in hushed tones, tried to start conversations about dinner or plans for the weekend, but Kurt's walls were high and immovable. His responses were short, his gaze distant. She had wounded him in ways that words could not repair. One evening, the inevitable confrontation arrived. Evelyn approached him in the living room, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes red from crying. "Kurt," she whispered, "please, can we talk? Just talk." He nodded stiffly, though his chest tightened. For a moment, she seemed like the girl he once knew, fragile and uncertain, but the memory of her betrayal kept his heart cold. The conversation began cautiously, but like dry timber near a flame, it caught fire quickly. Evelyn wept as she tried to explain her choices, how she had felt abandoned, how loneliness had carved her hollow while he spent nights at the shop. She spoke of neglect, of longing, of mistakes made in weakness. Kurt listened, his jaw clenched. So neglect justifies betrayal. His voice was calm but sharp like glass. You had a choice, Evelyn, a choice to tell me, to fight with me, to work through it with me, but you chose lies, you chose him. Her tears turned to anger, frustration bubbling under her grief. You don't understand, Kurt. You were never here. I was alone in that house even when you were sitting right next to me. The words cut deep, but Kurt did not yield. No, he said firmly. What you did wasn't about loneliness. It was about selfishness. You burned what we built because it was easier than telling me the truth. The exchange spiraled, both of them raising voices, old grievances spilling into the open. It was not just about Marcus anymore. It was about years of silence, about Evelyn's temper, about Kurt's tendency to retreat rather than confront. All the fractures they had plastered over with promises now split wide open. At last, Kurt's voice steadied into finality. "I can't do this anymore. I need space. I need clarity, and I need to be away from you." Evelyn's face crumpled in disbelief, panic rushing in where anger had been. She reached for his hand, begging, "Please don't give up on us. I'll change. I'll fix it. Just don't leave me." But Kurt pulled away, his eyes, once filled with patience, now held only resolve. "You already made the choice that ended us." In the following days, Kurt began packing his belongings. Each item stirred memories: the framed photo from prom night, the worn-out sweater she once borrowed and never returned. Each memory hurt, but each one also hardened his resolve. Friends and family stepped in quietly, offering their support as he prepared to leave. Evelyn moved through the house like a shadow of her former self. She tried to reach him, tried to apologize, but Kurt had already crossed a line in his heart. The home they had built together was no longer a sanctuary. It was a mausoleum of broken trust. When he finally walked out the door, suitcase in hand, the silence between them was deafening. Evelyn stood in the doorway, tears streaking her face, knowing she had destroyed the one thing that had ever truly anchored her. Kurt, stepping into the night, felt sorrow and relief intertwine. His world had collapsed, but in leaving, he took the first step toward reclaiming himself. Kurt's departure left the house hollow, a place that echoed with Evelyn's regret. She wandered through empty rooms, surrounded by reminders of a life she had dismantled, photographs that once brought joy now pierced like shards of glass. The air was heavy with silence, and every quiet night deepened her despair. Alone, she swung wildly between guilt, anger, and aching loneliness, her mind a storm she could not quiet. Kurt, meanwhile, moved into a modest apartment. It wasn't much, bare walls, second-hand furniture, but it gave him the solitude he needed. For the first time in months, he could breathe without suspicion pressing against his chest. Still, grief clung to him, and though he tried to focus on his work and lean on friends, the weight of betrayal was slow to lift. The distance between them was meant to bring clarity, but for Evelyn it only magnified her unraveling. Nights in their old home grew unbearable. The silence mocked her. Her shame twisted into anger, not just at Kurt, but at herself, at Marcus, at the consequences she could not undo. One evening, in a fit of desperation, she walked into the garage and stared at the boxes Kurt had left behind. Old jackets, tools, papers, relics of the life they shared. Her grief mutated into recklessness. Fueled by rage and heartbreak, she dragged the belongings into a pile in the middle of the garage floor. The sound of tearing boxes and clattering metal filled the air. With trembling hands, she struck a match and dropped it. Flames roared to life, orange tongues devouring fabric and paper, smoke curling up toward the rafters. At first, it felt symbolic, an act of purging. But within minutes, the fire grew uncontrollable, leaping from the pile to the structure itself. Neighbors noticed the smoke and rushed to call emergency services. By the time Evelyn realized the scale of what she had done, panic had already set in. She stumbled backward, coughing, frozen between disbelief and terror. The fire trucks arrived swiftly, sirens slicing through the night, their flashing lights reflecting across the neighborhood. Police followed close behind. As firefighters fought the blaze, Evelyn stood in the driveway, disoriented, ash clinging to her face. When Kurt arrived, alerted by a neighbor's frantic call, his heart sank. The sight of their once shared home engulfed in flames shattered him in a way even her betrayal hadn't. He stood on the curb, helpless, watching firefighters battle the inferno. The garage collapsed inward, sending sparks into the sky. Kurt's grief mixed with anger as he realized Evelyn hadn't just destroyed his trust. She had now destroyed his memories, his possessions, and a part of his past. Authorities questioned Evelyn on the spot. Her incoherent answers, trembling hands, and the evidence around her left little doubt. The investigators concluded the fire was intentionally set. The word arson hung in the night air like a curse. When the police placed handcuffs around her wrists, Evelyn broke down, sobbing, her face streaked with ash and tears. Neighbors whispered in shock, some pitying, others condemning. Kurt, standing only a few feet away, could barely watch. The woman he once loved was now being led into the back of a police car, her life unraveling in front of everyone. In the following days, Kurt faced the practical nightmare: insurance claims, damage assessments, endless questions from investigators. Friends rallied around him, offering support, but no words could dull the sting of seeing his home reduced to rubble. He moved through the motions in a haze, carrying both grief and a strange sense of inevitability. Evelyn, meanwhile, sat in a cold cell, her world narrowed to concrete walls and sleepless nights. For the first time, stripped of lies, stripped of comfort, she had nothing left but the consequences of her actions. The woman who once carried herself with fierce confidence was now a broken figure, facing charges that could alter her life forever. The fire had burned more than belongings. It had burned the last fragile bridge between them. For Kurt, it was the final confirmation. Their love was not only over, it was ashes. The fire and Evelyn's arrest had ripped away the last threads binding their marriage. For Kurt, the decision was no longer about whether to let go, but about how to untangle himself from the wreckage she had left behind. The legal process of divorce began soon after, heavy with paperwork, hearings, and an endless reliving of wounds that were still raw. Kurt walked into the courthouse each time with a quiet dignity, his face a mask of composure. Yet inside, he carried the weight of betrayal, loss, and exhaustion. He had imagined his future with Evelyn once: college graduations, a family, a home built with love. Now all he imagined was an ending clean enough to allow him to breathe again. For Evelyn, the divorce proceedings became another layer of humiliation. Still reeling from her arrest, she faced not only criminal charges, but also the public unraveling of her marriage. The town buzzed with gossip, each detail of the fire and the affair feeding whispers that followed her everywhere. Former friends avoided her gaze, neighbors crossed the street, and colleagues spoke her name with pity or contempt. The confident young woman who once drew admiration now lived beneath the crushing weight of exposure. The hearings themselves carried a grim theater. Kurt, steady and controlled, spoke truthfully of her betrayal, the affair, the fire. Evelyn, fragile but defensive, tried to explain her actions, her voice quivering as she shifted between remorse and bitterness. The courtroom became the stage where their love story, once so admired, reached its public collapse. The final hearing drew particular attention. The seats were filled with familiar faces from their community, neighbors, co-workers, even distant relatives who came to witness the conclusion of a scandal that had already defined them. Evelyn, visibly shaken, stood to speak. Tears blurred her vision as she admitted her guilt, not only for the affair, but for the reckless fire that had destroyed their home. Her words, filled with regret, echoed painfully through the hushed courtroom. Kurt listened, his expression unreadable. Part of him pitied her, seeing the woman he once loved reduced to ashes by her own decisions. But pity could not erase the truth. Forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. When the judge's gavel fell, granting him the divorce and outlining the consequences Evelyn would face, Kurt felt a rush of sorrow mingled with relief. Outside the courthouse, reporters and community members whispered as the couple parted ways for the last time. Evelyn walked alone, her shoulders slumped, while Kurt moved forward surrounded by quiet support from friends and family. He had lost so much, but he had kept his integrity, and that, he realized, was something Evelyn could never take from him. The public nature of their downfall left lasting scars, but it also began to reshape them. For Kurt, it marked the beginning of his healing, a chance to rebuild without lies festering beneath the surface. For Evelyn, it forced her into a painful confrontation with herself, one she could not escape under the scrutiny of an entire town. Their marriage had ended not in whispers, but in echoes heard by everyone around them. Yet in that public collapse lay the seeds of private rebirth, one forged in resilience, the other in regret. The ink on the divorce papers had barely dried when Kurt felt a shift within himself. The grief was still present, Betrayal leaves scars that never fully fade, but beneath it all was a fire he had not felt in years. Evelyn had taken much from him, trust, time, even the home they once shared. But she could not take his will to rebuild, and in rebuilding he found not only healing but a chance to claim a quiet, undeniable revenge. Kurt threw himself into his work with a new intensity. At the automotive franchise, his leadership shone and contracts poured in. Customers trusted his steady presence. Employees respected his fairness. Soon, whispers spread through town that Kurt might buy into ownership, fulfilling a dream Evelyn once helped him plan. The irony was not lost on him. She had betrayed him at the very moment his ambitions were about to bear fruit. Now, her absence only made his progress sweeter. It was at a local networking event months later that Kurt's path crossed with Lydia. She was striking not for her beauty, though she carried herself with elegance, but for the steady calm in her eyes. She introduced herself as Marcus's ex-wife. The revelation hit like a twist of fate. They laughed awkwardly at first, sharing the bitter truth of their connection, but soon conversation flowed. They spoke not as victims, but as survivors, each scarred by betrayal, each searching for solid ground again. Their bond deepened quickly. Over coffee meetings and long walks, they exchanged stories of lies endured and nights spent alone. Lydia's perspective offered Kurt something he hadn't realized he needed: validation. She, too, had lived through Marcus's deceit, and together they pieced fragments of their broken pasts into something that resembled understanding, and eventually hope. It didn't take long before their companionship stirred talk within the community. Whispers turned into knowing smiles when they appeared together at events. For Kurt, this was more than companionship, it was justice. Evelyn's affair with Marcus had destroyed their marriage, but here he was, standing proudly beside the very woman Marcus had once betrayed. His revenge wasn't loud or cruel. It was simply the quiet, undeniable message that he had moved on, and he had moved on with dignity. News of Kurt's new relationship reached Evelyn, even behind the walls of her incarceration. When she learned that Kurt was with Lydia, jealousy hit her like a blade. At first, it filled her with bitterness, but as weeks passed, it twisted into something more complex: regret. She could no longer deny that Kurt had built the life she had thrown away. Watching from a distance, powerless, she realized her choices had left her with ashes while he was finding joy again. For Kurt, Lydia became more than poetic justice. She became his partner in healing. Together, they built something Evelyn and Marcus never could: a relationship forged from honesty, respect, and the hard lessons of betrayal. They laughed freely, spoke openly, and refused to hide pain in silence. Where Evelyn had once wounded him, Lydia now helped him heal. One evening at a community event, Kurt and Lydia made their relationship public in the most natural way. Hand in hand, they moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. Supportive friends applauded his happiness. Strangers admired the resilience in his story. It was a moment of triumph not only for Kurt, but for everyone who had watched him endure heartbreak with dignity. His revenge was not fire, nor anger, nor bitterness. It was standing tall, successful, and deeply loved by a woman who had suffered as he had and chosen him freely. His revenge was in his happiness, something Evelyn could see but never touch. And as Kurt looked at Lydia that night, laughter lighting her eyes, he realized this was not just revenge. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. A new chapter, written not in betrayal but in trust. By the time Kurt had settled into life with Lydia, the sharp edges of his heartbreak had softened. The betrayal still lived somewhere deep in him, but it no longer controlled his steps. Instead, he found himself waking each morning with a sense of peace he once thought impossible. Love, real love, had returned to him, not in the form of youthful promises whispered under the stars, but in the steady, healing embrace of a woman who truly understood what it meant to be broken and rebuilt. Lydia carried her own scars from Marcus's deceit, but instead of letting those scars harden her, she chose honesty, empathy, and patience. With her, Kurt never felt the need to hide his fears or suppress his doubts. They spoke openly about insecurities that might have once festered in silence. Their honesty became the foundation of something stronger than either had known before. They traveled together, sometimes far, sometimes only to the countryside nearby. Each trip became a reminder that life could still hold beauty after devastation. They laughed over small mishaps, missed turns, burnt dinners, sudden rainstorms, discovering joy not in perfection but in companionship. Nights once haunted by memories of betrayal were now filled with quiet conversations, soft laughter, and the comfort of knowing they had found someone who truly stayed. Their relationship also extended beyond themselves. Kurt and Lydia became involved in community programs, speaking quietly but openly about resilience and recovery. Without ever seeking attention, their story inspired others. People who had endured heartbreak found hope in their example, proof that betrayal did not have to be the end, but could instead mark the beginning of something truer. As their bond deepened, Kurt realized that Lydia had not just given him love. She had given him freedom. Freedom from the bitterness that once held him, freedom to envision a future unmarred by lies. She was not Evelyn's replacement, nor was their relationship built on revenge. She was his choice, his partner, the proof that life could bloom again even in the ashes. When Kurt decided to propose, he did it in a way that reflected their journey, not with grand spectacle, but with sincerity. At a community gala, surrounded by people who had witnessed his darkest days, Kurt held Lydia's hands and asked her to build the rest of life with him. The room fell quiet, then erupted into applause as Lydia's tearful yes filled the air. It wasn't just an engagement, it was a victory, a declaration that love could be reclaimed even after betrayal. Their wedding came months later, a modest yet beautiful ceremony. Friends and family gathered, not only to celebrate their union, but also to honor the strength it took to arrive there. Kurt looked at Lydia as she walked toward him, her eyes steady and full of warmth, and for the first time since his world had fallen apart, he felt whole again. That night, as they danced under soft lights, Kurt reflected on the journey. Evelyn's betrayal had nearly broken him, but here he was, standing tall, not because of revenge, but because he had chosen healing. And in choosing healing, he had found a love deeper than the one he lost. Love after betrayal, he realized, was not just possible. It was more profound, more enduring, because it carried the weight of lessons learned and the strength of wounds that had healed. In Lydia's embrace, he discovered that the heart, though scarred, could still beat stronger than ever. Inside the stark walls of her incarceration, Evelyn, now reduced from the confident woman she once projected to someone simply surviving, faced the hardest reckoning of her life. The silence of prison was different from the silence of her home after Kurt left. This silence was unrelenting, pressing on her every hour, stripping away excuses and forcing her to confront the brutal truth of what she had done. Loneliness became her constant companion. Nights stretched long, haunted by memories of the life she had destroyed with her own hands. She saw Kurt's face in flashes, his disappointment, his pain when he placed the evidence in front of her, his silence as he walked out of their shared home. These visions carved at her more deeply than any bars or guards ever could. At first, Evelyn cycled through bitterness, blaming Kurt, blaming Marcus, blaming her circumstances. But as the weeks passed and the noise of denial finally drained away, only regret remained. She realized she had not only betrayed Kurt, she had betrayed herself. The fire, the affair, the lies, all of it had taken away the one person who had loved her unconditionally and left her reputation in ruins. Therapy sessions in the facility became both punishment and salvation. Forced to speak aloud what she had done, she began to see her own patterns clearly. Her impulsive anger, her refusal to communicate, her habit of seeking escape instead of confrontation. For the first time, Evelyn acknowledged that she alone was responsible. That recognition hurt, but it also cracked open a door towards something she had never truly embraced before: accountability. When word eventually reached her about Kurt's new life, about Lydia, about the engagement, about their wedding, it cut her deeply. Jealousy flared first, followed by sorrow so sharp she could hardly breathe. Yet as the days passed, something unexpected grew in its place. Gratitude. Gratitude that Kurt had found the happiness she could never give him. Gratitude that Lydia, who had suffered Marcus's betrayal, could also rise again. Evelyn realized that their joy was not an attack on her. It was proof that love could survive even the ugliest of endings. In her small cell, she began to write. Letters filled with apologies, first to Kurt, then to friends and family she had disappointed. She did not ask for forgiveness. She knew she did not deserve it. But she wanted them to know she saw her wrongs clearly now, that she was no longer hiding behind excuses. Each letter was both confession and release, helping her piece together the fragments of integrity she had long abandoned. Over time, her remorse transformed into action. She became a quiet presence of encouragement to other women in the facility, listening to their stories, sharing her own downfall, urging them to face their choices with honesty. Her vulnerability, once buried beneath pride, now became her strength. She could not undo the past, but she could choose what kind of woman she would be in the years ahead. Evelyn's regret was vast, stretching over every decision, every lie, every missed opportunity to fight for the marriage she had once believed in. But out of that regret grew something else, a determination to change. She could never reclaim Kurt's love, but she could rebuild herself, not for him, not even for forgiveness, but for the simple truth that her life did not have to end in ruin. Regret, she learned, could be either a prison or a beginning. And though the bars around her held her body captive, her heart, for the first time, began to break free. Years had passed since the fire, the courtroom battles, and the ink that finalized their divorce. Kurt had built a new life with Lydia, a life rooted in trust, resilience, and a peace he once believed he would never find again. Evelyn, on the other hand, had endured her reckoning, first through prison walls, then through long years of quiet service and reflection. Though her steps were now steadier, her reputation forever bore the weight of her choices. Fate, however, has a way of circling back. At a community charity event, one Kurt attended with Lydia and Evelyn with a group from the rehabilitation program, paths once severed converged again. When Kurt first caught sight of Evelyn across the hall, his chest tightened. Memories surged uninvited. The motel, the fire, the courtroom. Yet the man who stood there now was not the broken husband she had betrayed. He was stronger, rebuilt. Evelyn noticed him too. For a long moment she hesitated, her fingers clutching the strap of her purse, her breath caught between guilt and courage. Finally, with small but deliberate steps, she approached. The noise of the crowd dulled around them as if the universe itself leaned closer to listen. "Kurt," she said softly, her voice strained but steady, "thank you for hearing me even for a moment." He didn't answer immediately. His eyes studied her, older, more tired, but also different. There was no defiance left in her posture, no pretense of pride, just remorse. They moved to a quieter corner and for the first time in years spoke honestly. Evelyn confessed the depth of her regret. She told him of sleepless nights, of therapy sessions that forced her to strip away every excuse, of the letters she had written with apologies she knew he might never read. She admitted that seeing him happy again, with Lydia, was painful, yet also strangely comforting. "Because you deserved better than me," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. Kurt listened in silence, his expression calm. The anger that once consumed him had long since cooled. "I won't lie," he finally said, his voice measured. "What you did broke me, but I did rebuild, and part of that rebuilding meant letting go of hatred. Lydia and I, we live in honesty, something I wish you and I had found sooner. I forgave you long ago, Evelyn, not for you but for me. Carrying hate is heavier than betrayal." Her tears spilled then, but they were not the frantic tears of denial. They were the tears of a woman who finally heard the words that allowed her to release the last of her chains. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never expected forgiveness, but I will carry it with me as proof that I can be better." The conversation ended not with reconciliation of love, but with reconciliation of humanity. They parted with a small nod, a mutual acknowledgement that their story, though scarred, had reached its final chapter. Evelyn turned back to her group, her steps lighter than they had been in years. Kurt returned to Lydia, who listened quietly as he recounted the exchange. Her hand in his was steady, her presence a reminder of everything he had gained. That night, Kurt felt an unfamiliar calm. The past, once jagged and raw, now rested like a healed scar. Evelyn had faced him one last time, and instead of reopening wounds, the encounter stitched them closed. For her, his forgiveness became the anchor she needed to move forward. For him, it was the final proof that betrayal did not define his life. Resilience did. Their final face-off was not about victory or defeat. It was about closure. About two people who had once been everything to each other, finally stepping into separate futures without bitterness clinging to their heels. After the quiet but powerful closure of his final encounter with Evelyn, Kurt turned his full attention to the life he was building with Lydia. Their marriage was still young, but the depth of their bond felt forged in steel, tested by betrayal, strengthened by honesty, and rooted in a mutual decision to never repeat the mistakes of their pasts. Trust was not something they took for granted. Both knew better than anyone how fragile it could be, so they made deliberate choices each day to protect it. Conversations that once might have been avoided were now welcomed. If a doubt surfaced, they voiced it. If an insecurity stirred, they confronted it together. What could have become cracks in silence became bridges built on openness. Kurt had learned from Evelyn's secrecy, from his own tendency to retreat when conflict arose. With Lydia, he was different. He shared his fears of inadequacy, his lingering scars, even his moments of anger. And Lydia, carrying her own wounds from Marcus, responded not with judgment but with understanding. Their honesty became a language of love more intimate than any whispered promise. They also built trust through action. Date nights were not extravagant but consistent. An evening at their favorite diner, a late walk after work, a weekend road trip to nowhere in particular. These moments created memories not weighed down by betrayal, but filled with laughter and ease. Every shared experience became another stone in the foundation of something enduring. Together, they decided to attend counseling sessions, not because their marriage was broken, but because they wanted it to remain whole. The sessions gave them tools to navigate future conflicts, to communicate with empathy rather than defensiveness. For Kurt, it was an act of humility. For Lydia, it was a sign of commitment. For both, it was proof that love built on vigilance could thrive. The strength of their relationship soon rippled outward. Friends noticed the calm assurance between them, the way they leaned on each other naturally. Community members who had once whispered about Kurt's scandal now admired the dignity with which he had rebuilt. Couples sought their advice, inspired by their willingness to be open about pain and healing. Kurt and Lydia became living reminders that even shattered trust could be remade, not with ease but with intention. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued her path of accountability. Out of prison and immersed in service work, she began slowly earning back fragments of respect from her community. She spoke honestly about her downfall, warning others about the dangers of silence, pride, and unfaithfulness. In her vulnerability, she became a reluctant but credible advocate for change. For the first time in her life, her actions matched her words. Though Kurt and Evelyn no longer shared lives, their separate journeys converged in meaning. Both were learning. In their own ways, that trust is fragile but not impossible to restore. Evelyn worked to rebuild it with her community, while Kurt and Lydia nurtured it daily in their marriage. Different paths, but each a testament to resilience. For Kurt and Lydia, rebuilding trust was not just about love after betrayal. It was about creating a legacy. They began hosting small community workshops, teaching others what they had learned. That trust thrives in transparency, in consistency, and in the courage to confront pain rather than bury it. Their story, once defined by scandal, now began to shape others toward healing. As Kurt looked at Lydia one evening while she spoke to a group about resilience, he realized their marriage was not only a second chance for them. It was a beacon for others stumbling through their own darkness. Trust, once shattered, had been reforged in a fire neither of them had chosen, and now it glowed stronger than ever. Years after the courtroom battles, the fire, and the humiliation of betrayal, Kurt, Lydia, and Evelyn each carried lives reshaped by choices and consequences. What once had been a tangled storm of lies and pain was now a story moving toward its final arc, an arc not of vengeance but of peace. Kurt and Lydia's marriage had grown stronger with time. Their bond, built deliberately on honesty and openness, gave them the resilience to weather ordinary struggles without fear of secrets hiding beneath the surface. They often reflected on their journeys, recognizing that the pain of their pasts had forged the depth of their present. For Kurt, Evelyn was no longer the shadow in his thoughts. She was a closed chapter, one that had given him the lessons to live differently. Evelyn, meanwhile, had rebuilt herself piece by piece. Her years of service, advocacy, and humility had slowly softened her reputation. She spoke in community groups about accountability, about the dangers of silence and impulse, about how betrayal corrodes not just love but dignity. Some still judged her, but others began to see the sincerity of her change. She did not ask for pity. She asked only for the chance to use her story to warn others. A turning point arrived during a community event focused on emotional health and resilience. Evelyn was unexpectedly honored for her work in outreach programs. Standing at the podium, voice steady though her hands trembled, she spoke not of redemption for herself, but of the people she hoped to help. And then, before stepping down, she acknowledged Kurt publicly. "His forgiveness," she said quietly, eyes glistening, "was not something I ever deserved, but it became the anchor for my change. I owe much of who I am now to that gift." The room fell into hushed silence. Kurt, seated beside Lydia, felt his chest tighten. He had long since released bitterness, but hearing her words made something shift inside him. Final confirmation that forgiveness had not only freed him, but had given Evelyn a path too. After the ceremony, Lydia encouraged him to speak with her. They met briefly in a quiet corner, their exchange simple but sincere. Evelyn thanked him once more, this time without tears, without desperation, just steady gratitude. Kurt wished her well, not with anger or pity, but with a genuine sense of peace. That moment marked true closure. There was no rekindling, no illusion of repairing what had been lost. Instead, there was understanding. Evelyn's journey proved that even in ruin, growth was possible. Kurt's journey proved that forgiveness was not weakness, but strength. Lydia's presence proved that love, rebuilt on honesty, could flourish beyond betrayal. In the years that followed, the three of them, separately but connected by history, became unexpected symbols within their community. Kurt and Lydia continued to advocate for resilience and communication in relationships. Evelyn deepened her work in rehabilitation and emotional accountability. Their combined legacies whispered the same truth. Betrayal may scar, but it does not have to define. For Kurt, forgiveness was no longer just something he had offered Evelyn. It was the cornerstone of the life he now lived. And for Evelyn, that forgiveness remained the catalyst that turned regret into purpose. Closure had finally come, and with it, the freedom for all of them to walk fully into the futures they had chosen. The years that followed brought Kurt and Lydia into a rhythm of life that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the small, daily rituals they cherished: morning coffee shared at the kitchen table, late-night walks through quiet streets, the comfort of knowing the other would always be there. Extraordinary in the way their love seemed to deepen with each passing year, a love that had grown not from illusion, but from truth, scars, and resilience. Their home became a sanctuary filled with warmth and laughter. Friends who visited often remarked on the ease between them, the way they listened when the other spoke, the way they shared glances that carried more weight than words. Kurt, once hollowed by betrayal, now found himself fuller than he had ever been. Lydia, once wounded by Marcus's lies, had found a man who honored her not with grand gestures alone, but with the consistency of trust. Professionally, Kurt thrived. His business, once just a dream scribbled in notebooks, had expanded into a respected enterprise. Lydia supported him at every step, her sharp mind shaping strategies, her encouragement pushing him to seize opportunities he might have once hesitated to take. They were not just partners in love, but partners in purpose, their skills and ambitions braided together seamlessly. Their advocacy in the community grew too. Together they spoke openly about betrayal, recovery, and the importance of communication. Their story, once born of heartbreak, became a source of hope for others struggling in silence. Couples approached them after workshops with tears in their eyes, thanking them for proving that love could survive even after devastation. Meanwhile, Evelyn's path unfolded in parallel. Though her life had taken a different course, she found fulfillment in service, speaking to others about accountability and growth. Her presence at community events no longer sparked only whispers of scandal, but nods of respect for how far she had come. Though her story was marked by regret, it had also become a testament to change. Occasionally, Kurt, Lydia, and Evelyn crossed paths at public gatherings. There was no bitterness left, only quiet acknowledgement. Time had transformed them from adversaries into unlikely reminders of the power of choice. Choices to betray, choices to forgive, choices to grow. Each carried scars, but each also carried purpose. For Kurt and Lydia, love after betrayal had become more than personal healing. It was proof that second chances could be stronger than first ones. On their wedding anniversary, surrounded by friends, family, and community members who had witnessed their journey, Kurt raised a toast. His voice was steady, but his eyes softened as he looked at Lydia. "To love that survives storms," he said, "to the truth that makes it strong, and to second chances that prove our hearts can heal and flourish." The room erupted in applause, but for Kurt and Lydia, the world shrank to just the two of them. Their smiles, their clasped hands, the unspoken vow in their eyes, it was everything they had fought for. In the quiet that night, as they sat together beneath the soft glow of their living room lamp, Kurt realized the full circle of his story. He had once believed betrayal had destroyed him, but in truth, it had led him here, to a love truer, deeper, and more enduring than the one he had lost. Their new life was not perfect, nor did it need to be. It was real, built on foundations strong enough to carry them through whatever storms lay ahead. And in that reality, Kurt finally found what he had been searching for all along: peace, resilience, and true love that no betrayal could ever take away. And so this chapter closes. Her lies were publicly exposed, but my revenge went even further. In the end, betrayal always carries a price, and sometimes revenge cuts deeper than anyone expects. But the question remains, if it were you, would you have gone this far or chosen a different path? Let me know your thoughts below. I read every single comment. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. This is Cheating Stories 7, and I'll see you in the next story filled with twists, betrayal, and the unexpected.